Good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to the second webinar of the Engaged Communities series. So this series is a joint initiative by the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, or SAPRI, and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAJCO. My name is Indira Kara. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I'm a journalist, but I'm currently pursuing my MFA in creative nonfiction at the University of Wyoming. Before this, I was a Metro reporter for WBEZ in Chicago, and I also worked as a freelance health journalist supported by the Stanford Health Equity Media Fellowship. I want to tell you all a little bit about our organizing partners tonight. So SAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in 2001. Through community-based research and strategic partnerships, SAPRI drives impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It is dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring our communities are accurately represented in public policy. SAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the U.S. through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. We'd also like to thank the Saba Foundation and In Diaspora for their generous support of this series. The Engaged Communities series is designed to create space for South Asians and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and connect with resources that support justice and equity. Each month, we'll explore one of three core and interrelated themes: know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation and democracy through conversations with expert speakers, advocates, and community leaders. Tonight's panel, Standing Up, Your Rights with ICE and Law Enforcement, is about understanding how to assert your rights when interacting with ICE or police, whether at home, in your community, or on campus, or even at the airport. Before we dive in, just a quick note, this session is being recorded and it will be available afterward on SAPRI and SAJCO's platforms. Please feel free to share any questions that you have using the Q&A functions. We're going to try to get to as many as possible after the discussion. And so a little bit about the structure of our panel tonight. Each of our panelists is going to introduce themselves. Then I'm going to do about 15 to 20 minutes of questions directed to each of them. So like 45 minutes of conversation. And then I'm going to open up the Q&A chat and pull audience questions from there to wrap things up. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to our panelists to have them introduce themselves. Zahra, do you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Thank you so much, Indira, and to all of the behind-the-scenes organizers and organizations that are making today's conversation and this whole series possible. My name is Zahra Billoo. I am a civil rights attorney by training and the executive director at CAIR San Francisco Bay Area.
Thank you. Kulmeet?
Hi, I'm Kulmeet Galhotra. I'm an attorney in Chicago, Illinois. I'm retired from the public defender's office here in Cook County, where I spent 30 years representing people charged with various crimes for the last 17 years, primarily homicide cases. I'm also an adjunct professor at Chicago-Kent College of Law, where I teach things like criminal procedure and trial advocacy. So I'm happy to be here and share my knowledge of the criminal legal system with your viewers.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start with some questions for Zahra, but Kulmeet, of course, feel free to jump in. I want to start really foundational with some sort of general constitutional questions. So my first question for you, can you walk us through who is entitled to constitutional rights in the United States? Is it only U.S. citizens or does it apply to everyone?
That's such a good question because there's so much fear right now, right? And we are living under an administration that seems to disregard the Constitution for everyone, by the way, right? But it's important to know who we are and where we stand. Constitutional protections in the United States apply to everyone, irrespective of their immigration status. And so when we get into it, we'll talk about the right to remain silent, the right to ask for an attorney, the right to be treated with dignity, for example, less spelled out in the Constitution and more in the way case law has developed over the years, that applies to everyone. And everyone should be asking for it, and everyone should be asserting those rights. The one caveat I'll note is that it applies a little bit differently and in some ways barely when we are at borders. And so when we are at borders, we're not considered fully in the United States, even though we'll be on US soil and interacting with US law enforcement and Border Patrol. In those contexts, citizens have more protections than non-citizens. But otherwise, every day on the streets of the United States, undocumented, documented, citizen, someone with a record, anything in between, everyone has the same or similar protections.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll be talking a little bit about borders and technology later in the panel. Another foundational question for you, I feel like we hear about ICE a lot, but who is ICE? What is their role? What authority do they have?
ICE is short for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And, it's an agency that was created post 9/11, so it's fairly young. It's not as entrenched as, for example, the FBI. Their responsibility is enforcing immigration laws inside the United States. And so when we talk about a raid or an arrest targeting immigrants, it will very often be facilitated by ICE. ICE sits within the Department of Homeland Security and cooperates often with other law enforcement agencies. And so sometimes, if you're not in a sanctuary city or state, they're cooperating with local police. If you're coming across a border, they may be cooperating with Customs and Border Protection. If they're deporting someone, there are going to be other agencies at play there. But their primary responsibility is enforcing immigration law inside the United States.
And you mentioned immigration raids, and that kind of brings me to my next question, which is about holds and detainers. I feel like a lot of the time, when we hear about ICE, it's through the context of them having detained someone. So what does it mean if you are detained by ICE, and what rights does a person have in that situation?
Sure. So there are so many different phases of the immigration process, right? So there's applications and interviews on the positive side, and then you're going to look at detentions, deportations, and a variety of other things on the more difficult side. If you are detained by ICE, just as if you are detained by any other law enforcement agency, you always have the right to remain silent, and you always have the right to an attorney. Now, what the Trump administration is doing is really trampling on the question of whether or not you have the right to due process. And so one of the things that we always tell people on the right to remain silent is you can always talk yourself into trouble. You can rarely, if ever, talk yourself out of trouble. So if ICE or any other agency wants to talk to you, you should be saying, I'd like to remain silent. And you have to actually say it. You can't just stay silent. They are not mind readers. You always have the right to an attorney. Attorneys who are in trouble will also ask for attorneys to represent them. And so never think you don't need one, because even the lawyers get themselves lawyers. And then you have a right to due process. And so again, as with any law enforcement agency that is attempting to hold you, punish you, deport you, or anything else, you have a right to confront your accusers. You have a right to be notified of what's happening. You have a right to defend yourself. At this time, that right is very much under attack by the Trump administration. And we've seen this with them very rapidly deporting people without a day in court, or holding them in detention without bringing them to court. And so the first two are going to be what protects you, while the third is under attack.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And a lot of this has to do, obviously, with the administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act, which is still very uncertain about what kind of footing the administration's on, because customarily it's used when the country is at war. And the last time it was used was during the time, that unfortunate chapter in our history when we interned Japanese Americans who were citizens.
Yeah. For folks who might not know, would you mind just defining a little bit about what falls under that act?
Well, under the Alien Enemies Act, I'm not an expert on it. It's a federal act that was passed back in the 1700s, and the most recent usage, of course, was during World War II, after Pearl Harbor, and after suspicion was cast on everyone who is Japanese American, and they were rounded up and put into camps, basically. The government, of course, spent some time and effort in trying to provide reparations for the harm that they caused last time they used the Alien Enemies Act. And so currently the administration is alleging that there's a war from a gang from El Salvador, and they are now trying to deport people there without, as Zahra was indicating, providing them with due process, saying that it's not necessary to do that under these circumstances because we're at war. However, last time I checked, it was in constitutional law, it's the legislature that declares war, not the president. So anyway, it's a very interesting situation that we're in, and a lot of these things are not settled. But I think Zara is right that the focus has been on fear and creating fear among the population. I think Zara would probably agree with me that there's only room to detain 40 to 50,000 people in the entire United States right now. So a lot of this is just creating a specter and kind of creating hysteria and trying to get people to be so uncomfortable that they leave the country.
Yeah, yeah. And just a follow-up question, on the right to due process, and you will have mentioned that being under attack. If someone is detained, is there anything that they can do to advocate for that specific right to due process, or is that the role of their attorney who they've asked for?
Well, I mean, you can give up all your rights to due process by waving them away or signing them away and agreeing to, deportation or removal, waiving your rights. And so the whole idea is that people have rights that they need to assert. It's very easy to give up your rights. We watch television every day, and we see people being given their so-called Miranda rights, which have been around for decades now. And you have to realize that a lot of people give up their rights. After they're given those warnings, they proceed to waive their right to an attorney and give statements. And so the law allows for people to do that, but sometimes there's better outcomes for people who exercise their rights. So that's really what I think we're trying to talk about here and make people appreciate.
Yeah, and I have some questions about waiving rights later on as well. I want to take
add something here though,
Yes,
just to
of
like
course.
really plus one what Kulmeet said, because this is where I think the rubber hits the road on this question, and it's there are better outcomes for people who assert their rights, right? Not asserting your rights can never be used against you. Oh, sorry. Asserting your rights can never be used against you in court. So that this defendant chose to remain silent cannot be used against you. This defendant said something really dumb on accident will always come back and haunt them. And every person who thinks they're going to outsmart a law enforcement agent fails to do so. I've never seen anyone outsmart a law enforcement agent. Their whole job is to corner you into saying the wrong thing.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you. I want to walk through a few situations that folks might find themselves in if they are interacting with ICE, like different places that they might be. So, and just, get your thoughts on how someone should approach that. So the first thing I wanted to ask is like, let's say someone is at home and immigration or ICE knocks on their door. Do they have to open it? How should they approach that interaction?
Our recommend. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Kulmeet.
Sorry, I want to talk about this because this is very important, and this has to do with the constitutional rights that everybody has, whether you're a citizen or non-citizen. And that right comes from our Constitution. It comes from the Fourth Amendment in the search and seizure clause of the Fourth Amendment. What it says is that you don't have the right to come into my house or where I'm living unless you have a warrant that's been signed by a judge. A neutral and a detached magistrate is the term. And what that means is that these warrants that ICE have are not those kinds of warrants. A judicial warrant is a completely different kind of warrant. Usually it's issued by a district court judge or a state court judge or somebody like that. And you have the right to see this warrant before you open the door to anybody. And you can ask them to slide the warrant underneath the door, or you can have them put it up on the window, but you do not have to open up your door to anybody.
Yeah. Zahra?
Same. I mean, whether it's a stranger selling you Girl Scout cookies, right? Or somebody proselytizing their religion at your door. Like, we teach kids all the time, don't open the door to strangers. And it's as though once we become adults, we forget that rule and we're willing to open it up to law enforcement. But to Kulmeet's point, you have a right to be secure in your house, and law enforcement or any other government agent is not able to enter absent a signed judicial warrant. The only other way they come in is if you consent. There's a viral video coming out of Michigan yesterday that some people may have seen. A number of pro-Palestine activists had their homes raided. The cops broke down the doors. They did not present the warrant. So I'll also offer, and I'm hearing that there may be a warrant in that scenario, that there may be a warrant there, but it wasn't presented. So the way they get in is a warrant, your consent, and the third worst case scenario is force, right? Imminent danger, somebody called in an emergency. This happens when people's homes get swatted, for example, is a unfortunately common thing that is happening. If they are forcing their way in that case, you need to remember that your objection needs to remain verbal, right? So getting in the way of the battering ram trying to break open your door does not end well for you. And so I do not consent to your search. Do you have a warrant? And saying these things out loud is key, because later, if you end up in court defending yourself because they found something or something happened, those words will have mattered so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although a forced entry is pretty much prima facie, you didn't consent.
I know.
Yeah.
But I give it to Kulmeet, I give it to people as an alternative to physical objection. Like, that's why I give it to people, right?
Yeah, don't get hurt. Don't get hurt.
To do.
You may want to videotape it. You might want to get your camera out if they're going to be doing that. And
that is one of the instances where I would not object to the target of an investigation or an interaction recording. Ordinarily, I tell people, like, your goal is to get out of the interaction, not to try to sit there and record your conversation. But yes, in this one, if they're forcing your way in, and that's how we have the video from what happened in Michigan, is somebody inside the house is recording.
Yeah, absolutely. What about in a workplace setting? Can ICE or immigration come into a workplace, and in that situation, like, what rights do employees and employers have?
So law enforcement, including ICE, can come into any publicly accessible parts of a workplace. So if you work at a grocery store, they can walk into the grocery store. If you work at some sort of client-facing office with an open lobby, as many people do, they can walk into those parts of your workplace. There are also going to be private parts of a workplace, right? At my office, the entire area is considered private. You need an appointment to come in, and someone must approve who you are before you do. In a more public setting, maybe the employee lunchroom or a manager's office, right? A warrant or consent will be required to enter those private places. An employer who knows that they have at-risk employees, I would urge, has a moral duty to assess, right, whether or not they're going to consent to entry in those cases, and has to consider the legal risk of, could someone hide in my office if something were to happen? In general, though, right, whether or not there's an undocumented person in the workplace or you have other reasons for this, our recommendation is always going to be that there's no reason to provide consent. Either get the warrant or come back with the warrant, right? And let them threaten you about how they're going to come back with it. But why are you consenting? Again, if you may think you have nothing to hide, but nobody talks themselves out of trouble. So at work, public places are accessible to law enforcement, private places are not, and are going to require consent. In the worst case scenario, and I'm really hoping no one on the call has to live through the worst case scenario, but one of the things that we've also advised people who are worried about something like a workplace raid is that you never run during a raid. You don't run from law enforcement, you will get shot. and you're going to end up with much, much bigger problems. You never run, and actually, let me say this also in the context of a workplace, but anywhere else, you never lie or present false documents. So if you are undocumented and you are confronted by ICE, right, or, you're accused of any other crime and you're confronted by law enforcement, you never lie and you never present false documents. And so even if you have false documents that are helping you move through everyday life, I'm not offering any moral judgment on those. I understand people do what's necessary. But the moment you give that to a police officer or an ICE agent, you have committed an additional crime. And so you may have them. Stay silent, right? Stay silent includes don't produce documents.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much the law in most states where you don't even have to give your name. It's not in every state. It does vary from state to state. Later there's some resources that are available where you can actually read up on which state, or you can of course contact an attorney or something like that in your state to find out. But some states do require you to at least identify yourself by name.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like a name, rank, serial number thing in the military.
Yep. Okay. Okay. And we were mentioning what happened in Michigan, which brings me to sort of my next question, which is about people who are at school or on a university campus. What, I guess, are there documents that you would recommend that someone carry? Like how should they think about their rights if they're a student on a campus? Is that similar to a workplace? Is that,
There's a lot of conversation about which documents to carry, and I've even heard U.S. citizens asking, like, should I carry my passport, right?
Yeah.
I was on a call where I said, you don't have to carry your passport, and it's not really going to solve any of your problems if you are swept up by ICE. And somebody else said, but you know what? Like, it gives people a level of comfort. You're sitting in California, it may be harder in other places. And so I hesitate to tell people what not to carry.
Yeah.
Don't carry anything you don't want to get lost. Don't carry anything that is valuable, but carry an ID on you, right? A state issued or government ID. If you're a non-citizen, you may be required to carry your green card with you. And so follow the posted rules for whatever your status is. You're not, to Kulmeet's point, required to produce that. Could it help in a scenario? Yes, but you're not required to produce it either, except in the case of non-citizens, in which case you might be required to produce your actual immigration papers. But just the specific green card, not your birth certificate from Sudan. You don't need to carry that with you. And by the way, that's not going to help you if you're caught up somewhere.
Yeah. Speaking of documents, I want to chat a little bit about family preparedness plans. So, what is a family preparedness plan, and who do you think should have one?
So we've started to talk a lot about family preparedness plans, specifically with regard to undocumented folks who are worried about being picked up by immigration, right? So anyone who is undocumented and or someone who has a deportation order or is otherwise considered high risk. And most people who are high risk know this because they've had a consultation with an immigration attorney who told them. So I'm not talking about everyone that's scared. I'm talking about actual high risk people with high risk factors. In those cases, it's beneficial for people to think ahead about if something were to happen, who in their next of kin could, one, take care of their kids, knows the kids, has the phone number, right, knows the medical and health history, has access to any medication. That's one part, right, is my kids. And then the second is my finances and well-being. Who's going to pay the rent? Who can access the bank account? Who knows where any important documents are? A lot of times, one person in a family is handling all of these things. And if it's that one person that's targeted, then there's a lot of chaos when something happens, right? And so being preventative makes that easier. In other words, if some of these things are handled beforehand, then my family can focus on helping me get out of detention rather than on where are the kids and who's going to take them to school, right? And so write it down, organize it. We sometimes will go so far as to say it's important to have things like a power of attorney set up for the kids and a second, person accessing the bank accounts. And, maybe you're listening to this. So I told you who's high risk and who absolutely must have it, right? And then it sounded like I said, if you're not high risk, don't worry about this. That's not what I meant. What I meant is it's really urgent for people who are high risk in that context. But, things like the LA wildfires taught us that these things are good for everyone to have, right? And so do I know where if I have to leave my house in 30 minutes because it's going to burn down, where is everything? Like, is it in one Ziploc bag that I could grab and go, or is it in 6 different places and I can't actually find it, right? Same thing, right? Medicine, medicinal history, the bank accounts, anything precious. And so keeping those things organized is just good practice, but it is urgent for people who are high risk for immigration targeting right now.
Yeah. And, you mentioned family members. And I wanted to ask, if someone is detained by ICE and they are in that situation, what can a family member or a community member do to try and get help or start advocating right away? If say the person who has, been making this plan and in charge of all of these things has ended up becoming detained.
Yeah, so, if you have a high risk family member, it's important that you know their full name, you know their actual immigration status, you know their A number, and that's a specific thing that non-citizens will have. So knowing those things will help all of us locate a person if they go missing. Generally, somebody who is detained should have access to one or more phone calls. So that's sometimes it's the first point of contact. Those rights are not always honored. And so again, here is why it's important to know who they are, what their immigration status is, and what their A number is. A lot of people may have seen the video of Mahmoud Khalil being abducted outside of his graduate housing at Columbia. And you see that his wife is recording, and then she's also talking to his attorney. He says, call her. And so knowing who the family attorney is isn't just about the impacted person. The next person who could help should know it also. Reach out to the attorney right away. If you don't have an attorney, this is a good time to reach out to a community organization. And what community organizations are going to be able to do is lawyers and community organizations can do is help locate the person. So where were they taken? Using Mahmoud's example, actually, his family is told that he's in New Jersey. And so his wife goes to New Jersey and he's not there at that facility. And because they have his information and they're tracking him, they do eventually locate him in Louisiana, which is also where Rumeysa Öztürk has been shipped after she was picked up from Boston. And so lawyers and community organizations are going to help you do that. They're also going to help you assess what legal avenues for remedy exist. Is there anything that can be done? In some cases there is, in other cases there isn't, but a lawyer is going to be equipped to do that. And then, between lawyers, family and community organizations, and family and friends, publicity, right? Publicity and public advocacy are key. And so recently, members of Congress have been visiting their constituents who have been detained. And so somebody's got to ask them to do that. Somebody has to call NPR and say, this is what's happening. And if we look at why there's been so much public outcry about recent ICE actions, arguably that outcry has been mobilized by all 3 factors: good lawyers filing, strong cases, community advocates raising public awareness, including in the media, and then public officials also using their platforms to advocate. So there's a lot that can be done. Some cases are stronger than others, but it's, get a second opinion on that. Don't lose hope just because you think your case isn't strong.
Yeah. And I just a final question before we move into the questions directed at Kulmeet. I'm curious about, earlier in the panel, you mentioned borders and kind of how rights are a little, more in flux in that setting. And a lot of folks were curious about technology and privacy around borders. So do you have recommendations for how people should approach preparing their phones, their computers, their social media before traveling, crossing borders, even being proximate to one?
Yeah. So my baseline advice about technology is, hold on, let me get these words organized. Okay. We need to be careful about our phones and computers and iPads, whether we're at a border or otherwise. And so our baseline advice to everyone is, if you wouldn't want to see it on a billboard, it should not be on your device at all times, right? Whether you are planning a trip to another country, or you're planning to break the law here, or you are speaking ill of your employer, like, just be very careful, right? And our security and privacy is never fail-proof and is never foolproof. So what I mean by fail-proof is every app can be hacked, every phone can be left unlocked. And what I mean by foolproof is you never know if the person that you're messaging is going to take a screenshot of it and turn you in. And so, like, there's so much focus on the borders, and I always want to zoom out and say it's all the time.
Yeah.
Your device is not your best friend. For as much as you live on it, it's not. Now, with borders in particular, no, actually, so that's one part. The second thing, you should have all biometric identification on your device turned off. In other words, your face and fingerprint ID should be turned off. There is no warrant required for law enforcement to hold your phone up in front of your face and unlock it, or to require you to fingerprint into your phone. A warrant would be required if a password were in place, right? Because then the distinction we make is, I mean, to really explain it really rudimentary, and I'd be curious if Kulmeet would agree, law enforcement is allowed to manipulate your body. They're not allowed to manipulate your mind. And so they cannot get the password out of your head, right? They can put your finger somewhere because they fingerprint you when they arrest you. They can put your face somewhere because that's what they do when they take mugshots. But your
body's basically an exhibit.
Exactly. See, there you go. Your body is an exhibit, but what's in your brain? So that's like separate from borders. You don't put it on your phone if you don't want to see it on a billboard. And you should have a complex password on your device at all times. You get arrested at a protest and you have Face ID on, well, they've got your phone now, right? So that's no matter what. Now, across borders, law enforcement has the power to confiscate your devices. They also believe that they can and should access your devices. US citizens should always object to this, should never provide a password. Remember, I'm always going to assert my right to remain silent. That means I'm also not going to tell you my password. The biggest risk is that your device is confiscated. If your device is confiscated, ask for a receipt. But they're not going to be able to get into the device, even if they take it, if you had a password on it, and they couldn't convince a supervisor or later a judge to unlock it for them, right? They're just not going to be able to get in. Now, if you're a non-citizen, non-compliance could lead to inadmissibility, right? And so I'm going to refuse to give you my password. Okay, then look, you can't come in. I'm going to revoke your visa. Like, that is a high risk. And I don't want to tell people what to do here, because if I give it to them, maybe I put everyone in danger on my phone. And if I don't give it to them, maybe I don't come into the United States, which is why I always start with, it shouldn't be on your phone if you don't want them to see it. Because if your phone is inconsequential and you're a non-citizen who has to turn over your phone, then that's how you protect yourself. Can you travel with your actual device in your checked bags? Sure, but your checked bags are also subject to search. Should you travel with a burner phone? You can. It helps if there's very little on the phone. It's not required. It could still happen to you. And a lot of this, the thing is that's important is that this asserting our rights here isn't just about protecting ourselves. It's about protecting everyone. Because if you got into my phone, you would find my emails to Kulmeet, you would find my emails to Indira, you would find my emails to this, you would find my Facebook post about this, right? So then it's not just Zahra whose information has been exposed to law enforcement. It's everyone who associated with me. And years ago, I remember I'd have clients who they didn't cross a border. Somebody else did. They got asked about the person. And then months later, law enforcement is visiting my client saying, well, this person told us this thing about you, and we know it happened at a border. And so, the best way to secure your device is to ensure that there's nothing on it that's worth securing anyways, right? But make sure also that your biometric ID is turned off, and that if you're coming across a border and you're a US citizen, that you are absolutely refusing to unlock your phone for law enforcement.
Yeah, thank you. Kulmeet, I have Some questions for you now, especially about police and interacting with the police. And so my first question, again, kind of a basic one, but we've been talking about ICE, but how are the police different from ICE? And do your rights change when interacting with the police versus when you're interacting with ICE?
Sure. I mean, ICE has limited scope in what they're doing. They're enforcing immigration law. ICE is not pulling you over for speeding tickets. ICE is not going to be charging you with theft from the local retail establishment. ICE is not going to be saying that you committed a sex offense. Usually that's the police that's investigating. So what we're talking about is local police usually investigates local crimes. The federal authorities, the FBI, the ATF, etc., also have the ability to investigate federal crimes. Those are federal laws, which they may have jurisdiction over a particular person. But most common day-to-day crimes are crimes that are investigated by local police, and so that means in your city or your village, and sometimes, depending on where it is, the sheriff of that locality. The interesting thing we mentioned briefly was sanctuary cities, and in sanctuary cities, what you have, for example, Chicago is a sanctuary city, and Illinois is a sanctuary city state, a sanctuary state. During the Biden administration, many mayors from places like Texas and Florida were shipping a lot of people to places like New York and Chicago, for example, saying, well, if you're sanctuary cities, you take care of all these folks that have undocumented folks who've come over the border, etc. So in Illinois, though, there's really no cooperation between the federal authorities, ICE, for example, and the local authorities. So the local police, for example, will not say, hey, we have this individual, we're not going to charge him with an offense, but he's undocumented. In fact, under Illinois law, you're not police are not allowed to ask people about their immigration status. And the other thing is that there is no jail in Illinois that's operated by a county or by a city that is allowed to house people for ICE. So ICE has its own detention facility in the western suburbs of Chicago, and then they have one in northern Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, very close to just over the Illinois border, and then they have one in Indiana, and that's primarily because in Illinois, because it's a sanctuary state, the local jails are not being used by ICE. Now, of course, this will probably not be the same situation in a place like Texas or Arizona, for example, where it's a whole different kind of view towards cooperation. The authorities, when I say that, I mean ICE and state and local authorities. If the FBI have somebody, of course, they can hand them over to ICE because they're going to be cooperating among themselves because it's a federal agency. So there are rights that citizens have in police encounters, and those are the ones that really are found in the Sixth Amendment, because if you get charged with a criminal offense, for example, you get charged with a robbery or you get charged with stealing a vehicle, and the laws of the state impose a penalty on that, possibly going to prison for over a year, then every state in the country provides you with a right to a legal defense, and if you can't afford one, will provide an attorney for you, and you'll get rights. You get the confrontation rights, you get rights to compulsory process, to a speedy trial, all sorts of rights that are much more robust than just due process rights that you would have in an immigration court.
Okay. And before I get to my next question for you, we'll be moving into audience Q&A soon. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A chat. So earlier you had mentioned folks waiving their rights. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that happens? Like, does that happen accidentally? How does that happen? And how can people avoid doing that in interactions with the police?
Sure. So waiving rights, we talked initially about whether or not you waive your right to have a warrant, to have somebody come into your house. You open the door to them, they don't have a warrant. Well, you've given up your right to be free from that intrusion by inviting somebody in. Okay. But let's talk about statements. Many people give up their right to remain silent and have the things that they say be used against them in a court of law later. For example, let's say you made an admission to the police that you illegally entered the country and that you're undocumented. Now, you've made an admission. They can use that admission against you because you've given up your right to be silent. They cannot force you to speak, but you can give up your right. How do you give up your right? Well, by speaking, number one. Number two, by sometimes signing away your rights, because sometimes the police will present you with a written form, with a pre-printed form, which indicates what your rights are. I understand I have the right to remain silent, that if I can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for me, that if I can stop questioning at any time. So those rights will be on a form, and then they'll have you sign it or initial it. Once that's done, you've basically given away your rights. And if you converse with the police, they're going to be able to record and take down whatever you said and use it against you. And it's very difficult then for you to say something different later without looking like you're being deceptive. So it's always a good idea to exercise your rights to remain silent. And you can say, I am exercising my right to remain silent. There's many ways to say it, but that's probably the best way to say it. Some Supreme Court cases in the last 5 to 10 years have suggested that even if you just remain silent and don't say that I'm exercising my right to remain silent, if you say something like an hour and a half later, they'll consider that you didn't waive your right to remain silent, that you're actually talking. So it's very important to say, I'm exercising my right to remain silent. Okay. Having said that, the Supreme Court has also imposed a 2-week time limit on the right to remain silent. I'm sorry, with the right to an attorney. So you always have the right to say, I want an attorney. Okay. And that does not mean magically they're going to go to a law firm and bring an attorney to you. What it means is they stop talking to you about your case. Yeah. So if you want the police to stop talking to you and investigating and trying to ask you questions, then all you have to say is, I want a lawyer. And if you say you want a lawyer, they're not going to talk to you about anything. In fact, they'll leave you alone, and they may leave you alone for hours. Maybe 4 or 5 hours. And then what usually happens is people break down and they say, okay, I'll talk to you. And then they'll get re-advised of their Miranda warnings, and then they'll waive their right and begin speaking. Yeah. So it's very important that once you say you want a lawyer, that you stick to that and not speak to anybody until you see a lawyer. Because otherwise it's treated as reinitiating, and that's the mistake a lot of people make, is there's a slippery slope where once you start talking again, next thing you know, you're waiving your right to remain silent. So it's very important to remain silent. It's very important to invoke your right to counsel by asking for an attorney. And they may not give you an attorney, but they will, of course, stop talking to you. And if they don't stop talking to you and keep asking you questions, you may have a viable motion to suppress the statement that you've made. Many localities and jurisdictions also allow people a certain number of phone calls when they're arrested. So it's really important to use that right to make a phone call to inform your family, but not discuss the case with your family, because that's being recorded, and that the calls that you're making to your family are not privileged.
Okay.
So it's very important to be careful that when you're in custody, when you're speaking to anybody, if you're in custody, those conversations are almost always recorded, even if you're talking to an attorney sometimes.
Okay, okay. And a final question before we move over to Q&A. What do you advise that somebody do if they believe that they've been falsely arrested or wrongfully detained? What are the steps to, I guess, pursuing some kind of accountability around that?
Well, I mean, that assumes that you've now are released from that
Yeah.
situation and you're out of it. Well, I mean, I think one of the really important things to do is to understand where the civil rights bar is in your jurisdiction and approach attorneys that do civil rights cases where they're filing 1983 actions and other types of actions. Unfortunately, I don't know, Zara probably has more understanding about this. I think it's very difficult sometimes for non-citizens to pursue federal claims against
Mhm.
federal officers for violation of civil rights under Bivens and things like that. But I think Zara might be in a better position to answer that.
Clarify again.
I was just saying that I think for undocumented individuals, I think it's much harder sometimes to pursue civil rights claims in federal court against federal agencies than it is for citizens, of course, or even LPRs for that matter.
Yes. And by the time, so there's both the like, where's the law on this and it's going to be less protective, but there's also like, what is the practice on this? And unfortunately, for a lot of people who might have a strong civil rights claim, by the time they could raise it, they've been deported or they've been in
Yeah.
detention.
Right,
They're
right.
too scared to come forward.
And then there's always problems with things like qualified immunity, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the whole idea that the civil rights laws that are available can remedy some of the police misconduct. I mean, it's an ideal. I'm not sure it's as strong as it used to be.
Okay. Okay. I want to move into some questions from our audience. So somebody asked a question for both of you. If someone is undocumented and witnesses a crime, what are their rights when it comes to reporting it without risking their own status?
I think they're encouraged to cooperate in sanctuary cities because I think there's special visa status available to crime victims. Zara, I'm sure you know more about that. I don't want to talk out of my wheelhouse.
No, you're right. There is a special visa process for people who are victims of crime, and this is actually really key. And so I'm so glad that it came up because we will sometimes hear from hate crime victims who are afraid to talk to law enforcement, or witnesses to hate crimes who are, afraid to talk to law enforcement because they don't want to be deported, and we have to assure them that in fact coming forward in these scenarios can open up additional protections for them, hate crimes or otherwise. We've had clients where, victim of a random act of violence and there's no remedy on the criminal side, but because you survived and you cooperated with law enforcement, there's a different path forward for you that brings in additional protections.
Another question for both of you. This one's around the role that allies or neighbors can play during both an ICE raid or a police incident. So, what can someone who's witnessing something like this do to be helpful?
Well, they can help document it. That's for sure. They should be careful in not trying to interfere with what's going on because I think that's probably a recipe for disaster. But I think keeping a safe distance and documenting and taking notes of what happened, and then offering to be a witness in case they're needed.
Yeah. Another question, are there any recent changes or legal developments regarding ICE procedures that the community should be aware of?
I mean, it would seem the most recent thing, of course, is the Lake and Riley Act, which pertains to undocumented individuals who don't necessarily have to be convicted of an offense. They only have to be arrested or charged. They could be arrested and perhaps even released from custody and not charged and still be subject to Lake and Riley. But how that's going to shape up in the next 6 to 9 months is still yet to be seen, because I don't really think the statute has been tested to the extent that there's a body of law out there yet.
Yeah. Zahra?
I mean, I'll offer that, there used to be a method to the madness about how ICE operated in our communities. And unfortunately, the thing that's changed is in practice, more so than the law even. They are moving 2 steps ahead of the courts and causing a crisis where they are, in dispute with the courts. But what's been so scary for people is that it doesn't appear that there is a method to the madness. And so people such as Mahmoud Khalil, who have been targeted, he was a green card holder. Like he did not have a visa. He had not been accused of, let alone convicted of a crime. And then there's, for example, Mohsen Mahdawi, who went in for his naturalization interview and was detained during the naturalization interview. And so that's the thing that appears to have changed, that is causing understandable panic in our communities. And it's that I spent some time earlier talking about, if you're high risk and you're high risk and here are the factors, and all of that still applies, but there's also this yeah, but the green card holder and the person going in for their naturalization interview were targeted. And so that, I think that's worrisome about how the Trump administration is moving with regard to immigration, but also overall.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question that came in, are there any common misconceptions that either of you find South Asian immigrants specifically have about law enforcement or ICE that you have to correct?
I don't think I could say this about all South Asian immigrants, but I'll speak from my family's experience. My parents moved to the United States in the 70s. They both had, they were middle class in Pakistan, but had access to education and other things, and they came here seeking better financial opportunities. They both received their green cards fairly easily. And what I saw in that generation of immigrants that, my generation has worked for some years to change, is this, well, we came here the right way and we are deserving and we did this way. And those other illegals should know better or different. And I'm not saying that my parents ever took that position, but that generation of immigrants from South Asia did. And it eventually wasn't even true for their cousins. I have mixed status families, just one degree of separation away. And when there's a fight, people will threaten to call ICE on others. And so, yeah, it doesn't happen anymore, but it has. I remember growing up with those stories. We've had to work to change that. And so when I think about misconceptions around ICE and law enforcement more broadly, it's we are better than that, and whomever is being targeted is bad and deserves to be targeted. And what we've really had to turn around and look at is law enforcement doesn't care if you're Pakistani or Indian. They don't care if you are Bangladeshi. They don't care if you're Muslim or Hindu. They don't care about your family dynamics. If you need to be targeted by an administration, you are going to be targeted by an administration. And if you let your neighbors or your cousins be targeted, then you are also not going to be safe.
Kulmeet, anything that you want to add?
Wow, that's pretty powerful. I think it's very true. It's this whole model minority myth kind of stuff, and it is very generational in that respect. But I also think that South Asians have a tendency to trust government and to trust that, well, if I cooperate, everything's going to be great. And it's, people don't always have motives that are as kind as one would think.
Yeah. This is an interesting question. Someone asked if either of you had a real world, a case or a success story where someone asserting their rights made a difference in the outcome of that case.
I mean, in my practice, I've had countless cases that had good outcomes when people kept their mouths shut. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not even in criminal defense, so it is like 99.8. Like by the time somebody runs their mouth, I'm going to send them to Kulmeet or one of his colleagues. And so literally all of my cases are that. Like the FBI comes to someone's door, they say, I'm going to remain silent, I'm going to call an attorney. I call, and the FBI very clearly demonstrates that they were on a fishing expedition because they don't even have questions that they would share with me. And the reason they won't share them with me is because they were going to ad lib them with a nervous client without an attorney present, right? The moment I get involved and I say, look, I'm the attorney, what do you want? Tell me your questions. The FBI backs out of the situation. And the rare instance that they can produce questions and I'm talking to my client about it, we're still determining that it's best for my client to stay silent. It's when my client runs their mouth before calling me that I've got to refer them to a criminal defense attorney. And so it's literally everything I do. Like the reason my community and the people I've worked with have stayed out of jail. Not everyone, obviously, not everyone in my community, people go to jail, but like the reason all my clients are staying out of jail is because I'm convincing them to shut their mouths.
Yeah, yeah. It just depends on what your view is of the criminal legal system. Should it be one that's based on evidence, or should it be one that's based on star chamber confessions? And I like to think that if you have the evidence, okay, but if you don't have the evidence, then you don't have the evidence. And there's no reason people should create evidence by talking and making statements.
Yeah. Yeah. A final question for you all that I think is, Zahra, you've talked about how we're in really unprecedented times right now, but someone is asking, what does accountability look like for ICE in this administration? We're reading and hearing a lot about operations undertaken without due process, but what can be done about it?
One of the questions that this like dovetails for me that I've been grappling with is like, how do we build power, right? So less than 1% of people will be impacted by the worst case scenarios we're talking about. But I think the things that we can do is ensure that we are connected to our communities and our neighbors, right? And that's going to mean supporting Sajco, supporting SOPRI, going to your city council meeting. Even if you can't go every time, go once a month. Like your mayor should be on a first name basis with you. You should know the people in your temple or your gurdwara or your masjid, because God forbid something does happen to you. Those are the people that are going to be required to mobilize. And if something happens to one of them, you're going to need to be ready. Less than 1% of people will be directly impacted here, but all of us have an opportunity to do something about it. And if we don't, something else I've advised our audiences at various events is this doesn't end in 2028. There's a lot of like, we just have to survive 3.5 years of Trump. No, our trajectory is that whatever Republicans institute in chaos, Democrats sustain. And so even if a Democrat is elected to the White House in 2028 and then taking office in 2029, like it won't matter if we didn't lay down the groundwork to stop this now.
Yeah. Kulmeet?
Yeah, there's just so many things that we can't cover in just an hour, but there's so many resources that are available out there for everybody. I know there's a little handout that you're going to probably give, which has got a lot of really cool stuff. Among them is a link to NIJC, the National Immigrant Justice Center, and they have just a wonderful amount of information that's available for folks to help them answer a lot of their questions with regard to their rights as immigrants, etc. I've put a link in there to the ACLU as well. They've got these cards that you can print. You can print them in different languages even, which will tell you how to respond to police officers, like, am I free to leave? I do not consent to searches. I want to speak to an attorney. I want an attorney. Those three kinds of things are on those cards. People can print them out, have them with them, just as like a little crutch in case they're tongue-tied. If they are in an encounter, all they got to do is pull that out and read from it. They could even read from it in their native language.
Yeah.
And there's a couple other resources. There's one in there in case they do have a friend or a loved one that is in ICE custody, how they can maybe locate them with the A number. And I think there's a couple of other resources that I've thrown in there too that So, yeah, this is it's important for everybody to know what their rights are, because when we start, taking them for granted, that's when we start losing them.
Yeah. Yeah, and for everyone, we will send this out in the notes, but Kulmeet put together a great resource guide for everyone to take a look at after this. Zahra, are there any resources, organizations, things you want to add that folks could go to learn a little more?
Absolutely. So to connect with your local CAIR office, reach out via CAIR.com, CAIR.com. And if you look up CAIR on Instagram or X or Meta or Blue Sky or Threads or LinkedIn or all of the other platforms, you will find our offices. We have over 30 offices across the country, and we do everything from Know Your Rights trainings on request to direct legal services for people who are impacted by these types of issues. And so please reach out to your local CAIR office.
Great. Yeah. And so thank you both so much for taking the time to join us tonight. I just have a few quick notes before we wrap up. So one, folks have been asking in the chat if this is going to be recorded. Yes, it is, and it will be available through Sapri and Sajko's respective platforms. I just shared a link in the webinar chat. Sapri is conducting a live survey to better understand the experiences of South Asian immigrants. We would really appreciate it if everyone could just take a few minutes, complete the survey. Again, I just put that link in the chat. As I said, we're going to be compiling notes and takeaways from each panel, including the resource guide, and sharing that with you all. So please stay tuned for that in the coming weeks. And then please don't miss our next panel, which is the first one as part of the Unpacking Hate theme. It's coming up on May 8th at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central. That one is called From Hate to Hope, South Asian Resilience, Resistance, and Thriving Through History. I'm going to drop the link to register for that one in the chat as well, so folks can take a look. That is all from me. Thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for taking the time out of your evening to come and listen to this great panel. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you.